Good evening, everybody. We're so excited to have Kathy back with us to talk some more about Thomas Merton and to really explore the mysticism and the more mystical aspect of Thomas Merton. So without further ado, please welcome back Kathy.
Thank you to my lovely audience who's here again on a Friday evening. So we'll talk about the mysticism of Thomas Merton. The Catholic Church has had a distinctive group of saints we call mystics. You may even have a favorite mystic or two. Tonight we're going to talk about the mysticism of the most famous monk of the last century. As we discussed last week, Merton is not your typical saint. Likewise, he's not your typical mystic. I begin tonight's discussion by posing this question: what is mysticism? And here's Merton smiling at us, as if to say, well, good luck figuring out the meaning of mysticism. One of the most classic ways of understanding Catholic mysticism is through the 3 ways of the spiritual life. And this is a general program for any Catholic who is interested in growing in the spiritual life and preparing themselves for the possibility of mystical union with God. This is a time-tested Christian heritage bequeathed to us by saints such as Bernard of Clairvaux and John of the Cross. The 3 ways are the purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive. As John of the Cross teaches, all baptized Christians are called to the gift of union, and all embark on this journey beginning with the renunciation of sin. But not all would persist through the difficult challenges of the spiritual life. To do good and to avoid evil, to give up worldly pleasures for the sake of God, to persist in a life of prayer, to grow from vocal prayer to meditation, to mental prayer, and ultimately to praying without ceasing, to be utterly transformed into a holy person who even in this life tastes the goodness of paradise. Not many Christians have first-hand experience of all these stages of the spiritual life. The methods recommended to us by the saints are tried and true: faithful Mass attendance, frequent confession, praying of the Rosary, spiritual direction, corporal and spiritual works of mercy, contemplative retreats, spiritual reading, quiet time of prayer, fasting and penance, etc. Thomas Merton would affirm all of the above. His own vocation to the Cistercian order of strict observance was very much inspired by mystics such as John of the Cross. He practiced the Cistercian rules of silence, communal life, and penance, the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. I do want to once again affirm this about Merton, because we sometimes hear people question his allegiance to the church and to the faith. At the end of the day, he chose to remain a monk and a Catholic at a time when many priests and religious left their vocation and the church. But Merton was not your typical mystic. He was unique because he was situated in the modern age, as we still are. His struggles as a modern American individual are similar to our own, but very different from those of John of the Cross or Thérèse of Lisieux. To begin with, compared to the Middle Ages, the modern period has been called disenchanted. In the disenchanted world, The supernatural is no longer taken for granted. In fact, it is increasingly pushed out of the general worldview. Science is revered, mystery is relegated to the private realm. People tend to be unsure and agnostic on questions about the origin and destiny of human life. Creation, life after death, heaven and hell, these central tenets of Christian belief have more and more come into the category of doubt. Our concept of time has become secularized, one-dimensional, like a straight arrow dissolving into the future. Transcendent meaning connecting us with the eternal and the divine has been overshadowed by material concerns. In such a disenchanted world, our conception of self has also changed. We tend to operate as isolated individuals, or what philosopher Charles Taylor calls the buffered self, meaning that we live as independent subjects who keep a distance from each other, from the natural world, from the universe as a whole, and from God. We are first and foremost free individuals. Our relationship with one another is secondary, if important at all. The basic operating system that determines our outlook is our rationality as free individuals. In a disenchanted world inhabited by these free individuals, we end up having a set of nagging conflicts. We find ourselves divided on multiple levels, torn by the tensions between my desire as a free subject and what is called objective knowledge, between the freedom of my mind and demands of the world, between my free will and the burden of my body, between rational reason and reasons of the heart, between me as an individual and others who are just as strong an individual, between my freedom and the expectations of authority, between a purely natural life and the possible call of the supernatural. You might have noticed that our world, both inside and outside, is often colored by divisions and fragments rather than unity and wholeness. It wasn't always like this, but it was already like this for Merton. So take a look at these two images painted by the modern artist Edvard Munch, who died in 1944. These images of scream and melancholy capture well the emotional angst of the modern person. We are unhappy because we are divided against one another, divided within ourselves, and we have lost touch with God and with the spiritual source of life. So when Merton pursued the mystical life, he wasn't just in search of union with God. He was also looking for a living experience of unity, of wholeness. How can we live an authentic spiritual life so that we are once again made whole, one with God, one with our neighbor, one with all creation? Merton believed that such a life was possible if we could only begin to search for our true self. When we shed all pretense, lose our illusions, and come face to face with naked reality, when our hearts are awakened to the spiritual nature of existence, when we truly become who we're meant to be and who we really are, we will be whole again, and all will be well again. So Merton's program for the mystical life can be summed up as a search for unity by finding one's true self. So here are 2 points for us to remember. First is this desire for unity, for a world where God is all in all. And the second is this belief that we can begin this life by searching for the true self. For him, finding the true self is also the path to finding God, finding Christ, who lives within us and in whose image we were made. When we find our true self, it will be no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So I came up with this litany of the true self based on Merton's writings. Now, all these phrases point to the same goal of spiritual integration, of final spiritual health. You can take a minute to read this. The left column is cut off a little bit. So I will read what is here on the left side. A basic, inevitable human reality, spiritual self, the heart, the real meaning of one's existence, the inner sanctuary, my full spiritual freedom, inmost self, free and mature person, authentically existing person, the true indestructible and immortal person, and everyone standing on his or her own feet. The column on the right is specifically Christian, while words on the left can resonate with anyone, Christian or not. If this is Merton's program of mysticism, you can understand why he was able to reach out to even non-Christians. As a child of modernity, Merton embodied the struggles and desires of the modern person. So his mysticism takes on a universal and inclusive character that reaches beyond the visible border of the Catholic Church. Likewise, in the formation of his mysticism, he didn't just learn from the Catholic tradition. He read, befriended, and learned from many spiritual masters, some of whom were not Catholic. And here's why, in his own words. If I unite in myself the thought and the devotion of Eastern and Western Christendom, the Greek and the Latin fathers, the Russians with the Spanish mystics, I can prepare in myself the reunion of divided Christians. From the secret and unspoken unity in myself can eventually come a visible and manifest unity of all Christians. If we want to bring together what is divided, we cannot do so by imposing one division upon the other or absorbing one division into the other. If we do that, the union is not Christian. It is political and doomed to further conflict. We must contain all divided worlds in ourselves and transcend them in Christ. So Merton is saying that by uniting different spiritual elements in himself, he's helping the world to heal and to unify. By living the spiritual life, we can not only heal the brokenness in ourselves, but also in a hidden way, bring the whole world together into the love of God. So this is the guiding light of Merton's mysticism, from division to unity, from fragmentation to integration, from conflict to oneness in God. I would like to follow Merton's spiritual journey in a roughly chronological manner tonight and show you some highlights of his mysticism, as well as the different kinds of resources he learned from. We will see that the spiritual life to Merton was like an adventure and a pilgrimage. He was not afraid to travel, both geographically and spiritually. He struggled and faced his difficulties courageously. He hoped and looked for God in many diverse places. I will begin with the year 1933. When Merton was summer vacationing in Rome before he began his education in Cambridge. At this time, he did not care for organized religion. He thought that Christianity was rather superficial, hypocritical, and uninspiring. He thought that the Victorian spirituality of England was nothing but teaching people how to be a gentleman, and that the Zion Episcopal Church in New York, where his grandparents attended, was all about living life as a good middle-class citizen and loving other middle-class citizens. Religion to him was pretty much a fraud, the opium of the people, as Karl Marx had said. But while he was in Rome, he found himself immersed in the dense atmosphere of the Western Christian heritage. The visual witness of the early Christian martyrs was everywhere, moving his heart despite his anti-religious attitude. He was attracted to the great churches of Rome and the art on their walls. He loved the Byzantine mosaics and was compelled to find out more about this mysterious person who was called Christ. Despite himself, and in an obscure way, he was drawn to the presence and grace of Christ who dwelt in these great churches. He began to pray in them and study the Latin Vulgate Bible in order to understand the mosaics. Although feeling awkward and self-conscious as a non-Catholic in an august Catholic church, he lit a candle at Saint Sabina's and prayed for his father's soul. And one night, while he was in his hotel room, something unexpected happened. It was night. The light was on. Suddenly, it seemed to me that Father, who had now been dead more than a year, was there with me. The sense of his presence was as vivid and as real and as startling as if he had touched my arm or spoken to me. The whole thing passed in a flash, but in that flash, instantly, I was overwhelmed with a sudden and profound insight into the misery and corruption of my own soul. And I was pierced deeply with a light that made me realize something of the condition I was in, and I was filled with horror by what I saw, and my whole being rose up in revolt against what was within me. And my soul desired escape and liberation and freedom from all this with an intensity and an urgency unlike anything I had ever known before. And now I think for the first time in my whole life I began to pray. Praying not with my lips, my intellect, my imagination, but praying out of the very roots of my life and of my being. That story was recounted in the Seven-Storey Mountain. I wanted to highlight this episode not only because of what happened in it, but also because of the environment in which it happened. For much of his childhood, Merton had been immersed in the sights, sounds, and smells of the Western religious heritage. He was born under the ruins of the monastery of Saint Michel de Cuxa, surrounded by other monasteries in the mountains. While living in Europe, his living quarters were often in the midst of the ruins of old abbeys and religious houses. And now he had his first mystical experience in Rome, nestled in a multitude of mosaics, churches, martyrs, signs, and stories of the Christian church. So the moral here is to never underestimate the power of religious art, historical sites, and sacred buildings such as Rome and this parish church. The second period I want to mention is Merton's college experience in Columbia. This was the decisive time that led to his conversion. One particular group of people at this time became a surprising source of inspiration for him, and this was a group of poets, novelists, writers, and artists who may or may not be Christian. One of these was the English writer and philosopher Aldous Huxley. Though Huxley was not a Christian, his book, Ends and Means, provided Merton with a breakthrough by emphasizing the need to purify and elevate the mind through prayer and asceticism. The book discusses the social problems in modern society, practical solutions, and the importance of the spiritual order. It is this book that won Merton over to the mystical life. It also introduced him to the resources of Oriental mysticism, which would remain a strong interest for the rest of his life. I should also mention that Merton did not absorb Huxley uncritically. Some years later, he would debate with him on whether the mystical experience is similar to drug-induced psychedelic experience. Merton thought that the manipulative nature of drugs makes them drastically different from an authentic spiritual life. I'm sure you're glad to hear that. There would be many literary influences like Huxley in Merton's life. Some of them helped bring him into the Catholic Church, even if they themselves were not Christian. Others deepened his commitment to the spiritual life and enriched his contemplative sensibility. As a pattern, he would learn what is good and beautiful in their works, but go beyond them. So here are some more examples of these writers. The poet and artist William Blake lived over a century and a half earlier than Merton. But due to the influence of his father, Merton had been in love with Blake's poetry and art ever since he was a child. He wrote his master's thesis on Blake. The two shared some similar experience in their family background, in their deep concern with social issues and with war. Blake nominally belonged to the Church of England, but he was in many ways a rebel against Orthodox religion. But it was through Blake's poems that Merton found something of God's grace in his difficult childhood years. They sowed some seeds for the spiritual life that would continue to grow. Despite Blake's antipathy for organized religion, Merton saw in him an intense faith, which inspired himself to seek something similar. He also admired Blake's life of poverty and discipline chosen for the sake of art. Both of them loved art as a creative medium and expression for the spiritual life. Both were driven to create poetry and visual art as a path of the mystical life. Another writer important to Merton's life was James Joyce, with whom he shares the insight that the extraordinary can be found in the ordinary. He saw that James Joyce was the greatest writer of the 20th century, by the way. Gerard Manley Hopkins was another literary and spiritual inspiration. He was an English poet and a Jesuit priest who believed, like Merton, that the world is charged by God's grandeur. A famous verse from his poem, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, goes like this: Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Isn't this the very secret that all mystics know? To see the image of Christ in creation, the divine in the human. Isn't this the very essence of the mystical life? One more writer I would like to mention is Henry David Thoreau, an American transcendentalist, poet, and philosopher in the 19th century. More than anything else, Thoreau resonated with Merton because of his love for the solitary life. In his famous book, Walden, which is a reflection on simple living in natural surroundings, Thoreau writes, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to confront only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what I had to teach, and not when I came to die to discover that I had not lived. This is the same exact motivation that called Merton to the monastic life, and after he got there, to the solitary life of a hermit. In Merton's own words, living in the woods in Gethsemane was a reminder that he is free to embrace the necessity of his own nature. He's free not to be a statistic. To live in the woods is a sort of paradox. One becomes a nobody, but at the same time, one is freed from the illusions of the world and is free to find one's true face in all simplicity. The love of solitude and the contemplation of nature are, of course, not modern inventions, but these are practices all traditional mystics would emphasize. From desert monks of the 4th century to Thoreau and Merton, those invested in the spiritual life all knew the importance of meditating through the silent beauty of nature. For us today, it is perhaps more urgent than ever due to the constant noise and distraction technology has imposed on us. How can there be contemplation without silence and solitude? I'd like to read you a snippet of Merton's experience living in the woods of Kentucky. I am out of bed at 2:15 in the morning when the night is darkest and most silent. Perhaps this is due to some illness or other. I find myself in the primordial lostness of night. Solitude, forest, peace, a mind awake in the dark, looking for a light, not totally reconciled to being out of bed. A light appears, and in the light an icon. There is in the large darkness a small room of radiance with psalms in it. The psalms grow up silently by themselves without effort, like plants in this light which is favorable to them. The plants hold themselves up on stems which have a single consistency, that of mercy, or rather great mercy. Magna Misericordia. In the formlessness of night and silence, a word then pronounces itself, mercy. So far, I have mentioned some literary authors who were great inspirations for Merton. These, like Aldous Huxley, William Blake, and Henry David Thoreau, were not Catholics. They might even have had strong anti-Catholic tendencies. Yet their spiritual insights had a tremendous power in leading Merton deeper into this contemplative life. The reason I mention them is to suggest that spirituality and mysticism seem to have a universal nature that does not stay confined to the visible boundaries of the church. Merton's story helps us see that a spiritual encounter with God and with ultimate reality can be had in many different circumstances. Good literature, even if it's not explicitly Catholic or Christian, can become an instrument of God if it deals with the insights of the spiritual life. Now, having said this, I will now discuss the Catholic sources of inspiration for Merton, and there are many of them. These are only some of the most well-known Catholic authors that Merton holds dear. I will briefly discuss just a few of these. John of the Cross was Merton's first love when it comes to Catholic mysticism. He's probably a must-read for Catholics who are interested in mysticism. What he does best is to give a clear explanation through his own life, his poetry and commentaries on how we can approach all life's difficulties through the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. We are all called to the happiness of union with God, John tells us. Yet the path to that union is the narrow gate and the constricted road. We all must pass through the dark night in order to enter the dawn of divine life. So it is a great consolation and encouragement to hear from John and from Merton, and indeed from all Catholic saints, that whatever difficulties we may have in this life, behind and in the midst of them is the presence of the divine bridegroom. Facing our difficulty patiently is a path of grace through which we become like Jesus, the divine bridegroom. I would like to mention also Therese of Lisieux. Though Merton didn't care much for the sentimentality that often surrounds Catholic devotion to the little flower, he deeply appreciated the authenticity of her spirituality, so much so that he promised to be her monk if he did end up getting into the Trappist monastery. He was especially impressed with her heroic virtues, which developed not from any extraordinary suffering, such as in the case of John of the Cross, but from a comfortable and mediocre background of petite bourgeoisie. As Merton's biographer, Monica Furlong, comments, The truly remarkable thing about Therese is that she took her own very human failings, her longing for love and attention and acclaim, her overweening spiritual ambition, exactly as they were in all their silliness and childishness, and began to work with them. She detached herself from the particular shame of such feelings by owning them. She took the scrap of life allowed to her and transformed it. So you may remember the story about Therese falling asleep during meditation. She did that a lot, even sometimes during Thanksgiving after communion. But this weakness did not distress her, because she figured that little children were equally dear to their parents, whether they were asleep or awake. So the mysticism of Therese is really the spiritual fragrance of everyday life, but is perceptible only to the little children of the world. To her, God is like a father who is more tender than a mother. And to love God means meeting him at the bottom of the valley of humility, like a child. She recalls the story in the Bible where Jesus refuses the request of the mother of the sons of Zebedee, who wished that her two sons would sit on the left and right of Jesus in his kingdom. So Therese speculates that those privileged seats would actually belong not to any super-duper apostles, but to the little children of the world. Now, that's quite a beautiful thought, if you ask me. Merton agreed with Therese that the true mystic does not live on top of lofty clouds, but walks in the humble soil of everyday life. The true mystic is a child full of trust and love, not an angel immersed in extraordinary light. The heart of a child is, in fact, a great symbol for Merton, for an authentic spiritual life. And here's what he says. The contemplative is not the man who has fiery visions of the cherubim carrying God on their imagined chariot, but simply he who has risked his mind in the desert beyond language and beyond ideas, where God is encountered in the nakedness of pure trust. The message of hope the contemplative offers you is whether you understand or not, God loves you. He is present to you, lives in you, dwells in you, calls you, saves you, and offers you an understanding and a light which are like nothing you ever found in books or heard in sermons. Moving to the center picture here, I would also like to mention Merton's indebtedness to Julian of Norwich. This 14th century mystic from England, whose historical period was ravaged by the Black Death, is famous for saying, out of conviction for the grace and love of God, that all shall be well. All manner of things shall be well. Julian is especially important to Merton in helping him appreciate the feminine aspect of God. According to Julian, the deep wisdom of the Trinity is our mother, and Jesus is our true mother and the true mother of life. In him, we're endlessly born. Jesus feeds and fosters us out of a noble, sovereign nature of motherhood. In Christ, our mother, we are reformed and restored by mercy. Even in the face of our sin, there is a marvelous, lofty secret hidden in God, ordained by God from eternity, treasured and hidden, by which he will make all things well. God loves us and delights in us and wills that in the same way we love him and delight in him and strongly trust in him, and all shall be well. Very comforting words from Julian. Next, I would like to mention the Desert Fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries. In 1960, Merton published a small book, the cover of which you see on the right side. And this is his own translation of some of the most famous sayings and stories of the Desert Fathers. He believes that these fathers lived a practical and unassuming wisdom that is at once primitive and timeless. a kind of simplicity that our time desperately needs. He says that the modern scientific man can sail to the moon, but cannot cross the abyss that separates us from ourselves. To do that, we will have to learn the humble silence and wisdom of these desert fathers. I would like to recount for you a few of these stories Merton translated, just to show you what special people these fathers were. The first is about distracting thoughts. So a brother came to Abbot Pastor and said, "Many distracting thoughts come to me during prayer. I am in danger because of them. How can I make them stop?" The elder threw him out into the open and said, "Open up the shirt on your chest and catch the wind in it." He replied, "This I cannot do. I cannot catch the wind." So the elder said to him, "If you cannot catch the wind, neither can you prevent distracting thoughts from coming into your head. Your job is to say no to them." The second story can be titled, "We No Longer Need You, O God." So one of the brothers had been insulted by another, and he wanted to take revenge. He came to Abbot Father and told him what had taken place, saying, "I am going to get even, Father." But the father begged him to leave the affairs in the hands of God. He refused. He says, "I will not give up until I have made that fellow pay for what he said." So the elder stood up and began to pray in this way, "O God, you are no longer necessary to us. And we no longer need you to take care of us, since, as this brother says, we can and should and will avenge ourselves." So after hearing this, the brother got the point and promised to give up his idea of revenge. The third story is about mercy. An elder was approached by a soldier who asked him whether God would forgive a sinner like him. And the elder said to the soldier, "Tell me, beloved, if your cloak is torn, would you throw it away?" The soldier said to him in reply, "No, I will mend it and put it back on." The elder said in reply, "If you take care of your cloak, then how much more will God be merciful to sinners who are made in his own image?" So this story happened in the 4th century. In our world, we might say, we definitely will not throw our iPhones away if there's a crack in it. Right? So how much more so would God not throw away a sinner, but instead have mercy on us and mend all our faults? Speaking of faults, we know that monasteries used to have fault chapters, where if a brother had committed a sin or an offense, would come and receive a communal correction. So a brother in the Egyptian monastery of Skeit happened to commit a fault, and the elders assembled and sent for Abbot Moses to join them. He, however, did not want to come. The priest sent him a message saying, "Come, the community of the brothers is waiting for you." So he arose and started off, and taking with him a very old basket full of holes, he filled it with sand and carried it behind him. The elders came out to meet him and said, "What is this, Father?" The elder replied, "My sins are running out behind me, and I do not see them, yet here I come to condemn the sins of another." They, after hearing this, got the point and said nothing to the brother, but pardoned him. So that's a great ending to a story. Also reminds me of the Bible story where Jesus forgave the woman who was caught in adultery. One final story is about how to be saved. Some of the brothers said to the famous abbot Saint Anthony of Egypt, "We would like you to tell us a word by which we can be saved." The elders said, "You have heard the scriptures. They ought to be enough for you." But they said, "We want to hear something from you, Father." The elder answered them, "You have heard the Lord say, 'If a man strikes you on the left cheek, show him also the other. They said to him, "This we cannot do." He said to them, "If you cannot turn the other cheek, how about you take it patiently on this one?" They replied, "We cannot do that either." He said, "If you cannot even do that, at least do not go striking others more than you would want them to strike you." They said, "We cannot do that either." Then the elder said to his disciple, "Go cook up some food for these brothers, for they are very weak." Finally, he said to them, "If you cannot even do this, how can I help you? All I can do is pray." Now, this one is my favorite because I do feel like one of these brothers sometimes. And thankfully, we will always have recourse to prayer, if not always to holiness. Now, the Desert Fathers, as you know, belong to both the Latin and Eastern Orthodox traditions. Merton belonged to the Latin rite, but he loved very much Eastern Orthodox spirituality, which was another significant source of his mysticism. I will mention just one writer that Merton was especially fond of reading, Paul Evdokimov, who wrote one of the most beautiful books on marriage as a sacrament of love. To illustrate, here's a beautiful quotation from Evdokimov about prayer. "It is not enough to say prayers. We must be prayer, prayer incarnate. All of life, each act, every gesture, even the smile of the human face must become a hymn of adoration, an offering of prayer. One should not offer what one has, but what one is." Merton would agree with this wholeheartedly. From Paul Evdokimov and others from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Merton would learn a very important theme, which is wisdom Sophia as a cosmic presence of the eternal God. Christ, as you know, is the wisdom incarnate. But the biblical terms for wisdom in Hebrew, which is Chokmah, and in Greek, Sophia, are both feminine in gender, suggesting that the mode of presence of wisdom in the world is feminine. This wisdom Sophia tradition is rooted in the Jewish sapiential tradition, which gave us the great wisdom books in the Bible, such as Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Wisdom of Solomon, etc. As we read from Proverbs chapter 8, wisdom wanders the streets and calls to all the people, inviting them to her instruction in the ways of righteousness. The same chapter also says that wisdom was the first of God's creation, the first of God's works. She was formed at the very beginning, before the world came to be. She was there when he set the heavens in place. When God marked out the foundations of the earth, she was constantly at his side, filled with delight day after day, rejoicing in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in mankind. We gather from this that even before Christ was born of the Virgin, eternal wisdom was already, is now, and will always be present in the world. So one day in 1958, Merton had a dream in which he was embraced by a young Jewish girl. She was a nice kid in a plain, sincere sort of way. He asked her name, and she said her name is Proverb. This drawing on the left is his later artistic rendition of that dream. Christ revealing Proverb, whose feminine image is a symbol of wisdom. On the right is another of his drawings of wisdom Sophia. These feminine images would become for Merton a different sign of God's presence in the world. God is not a rational, intellectual, masculine presence, but a gentle and silent spirit of tenderness. In his poem, Hagia Sophia, Merton writes, all the perfections of created things are also in God. Therefore, God is at once Father and Mother. As Father, he stands in solitary might, surrounded by darkness. As Mother, his shining is diffused, embracing all his creatures with merciful tenderness and light. The diffuse shining of God is Hagia Sophia. We call her his glory. In Sophia, his power is experienced only as mercy and as love. She is in all things like the air receiving the sunlight. In her they prosper. In her they glorify God. In her they rejoice to reflect him. In her they are united with him. She is the union between them. She is the love that unites them. She is life as communion, life as thanksgiving, life as praise, life as a festival, life as a glory. As we meet here tonight in this sanctuary, Wisdom Sophia is in our midst, in our breathing, in our heartbeats. She is with all the human children of the world, the lonely, the wounded, the rejected, the hidden, the nameless, for she is the very breath of God, his light, his mercy, the foundation of our life. She's with sinners and with those who have not heard of Christ. She's with heaven and earth, with the moon and stars, with the shrubs and thorns, for she is the eternal wisdom through whom God created all creation. In Merton's experience, Wisdom Sophia helped him realize in a vivid way his absolute oneness with others. If you visit the town of Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, you will see this plaque in honor of Merton's sudden revelation, which happened one day in 1958 as he was passing through the streets. So this was what happened to him during that revelation. I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness. So this should be a lovely tourist spot to visit someday. The final source of Merton's spirituality I would like to mention is Zen Buddhism. Like Merton, I do not think that Catholics should be afraid of learning from other religious traditions. It is not scary that our young people may be reading non-Christian books on spirituality. The world has become globalized a long time ago. We can no longer go back to a sense of isolation and superiority, hoping that somehow the next generation will be shielded from other voices. They will not be. In fact, we as Catholics have an obligation to make sense of our relationship with other religions so as to better understand our own identity and our mission in the world. Now, Merton was a pioneer in this regard. He never wavered in his Catholic faith, but he was able to appreciate the beautiful insights of other religions, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. As a result of his engagement with them, his own spiritual life was enriched and expanded. So this is a book Merton translated of the writings of Zhuangzi, who was one of the most revered Chinese philosophers among Zen Buddhists. I will tell you a story from this book that takes place between Zhuangzi and Huizi. The story is titled The Useless. Huizi says to Zhuangzi, "All your teaching is centered on what has no use." Zhuangzi replies, "If you have no appreciation for what has no use, you cannot begin to talk about what can be used. The earth, for example, is broad and vast, but of all this expanse, a man uses only a few inches upon which he happens to be standing. Now suppose you suddenly take away all that he is not actually using, so that all around his feet a gulf yawns, and he stands in the void, with nowhere solid except right under each foot. How long will he be able to use what he is using? Huiz says, it would cease to serve him any purpose. So Zhuangzi concludes, this shows the absolute necessity of what has no use. Now this is a rather silly story told to make a point. And the point is, life would not be life if we only think about what is useful and disdain what is useless. We can relate this to one of the Buddhist concepts very attractive in the West, which is called mindfulness. To be mindful, one has to learn to embrace the present moment in all its aspects, useful or useless, beautiful or ugly, exciting or scary, bright or sad, extraordinary or mundane. It is actually quite similar to the Catholic concept of the sacrament of the present moment, or the little way of Therese of Lisieux. Unless we learn to appreciate the useless, we will miss many dimensions of the gift of life. We will miss the presence of God who is hidden in the useless. In Merton's words, it is the contemplative, the silent, the empty, and the apparently useless element in the life of prayer which makes it alive. With that nice story, we are now at the end of tonight's reflection. So let's have a quick recap. We began with Merton's modern approach to mysticism. He was different from the traditional mystics of the Middle Ages because he lived in a disenchanted world. As a modern individual, he struggled with a lack of wholeness, torn by the experience of division both within and without. Mysticism or contemplation was the path through which he would be healed. And not only that, it is the only path through which healing, unity, and peace can be rediscovered and realized in the world. So for the sake of this unity, Merton dove into the spiritual life. He explored God's presence in familiar and surprising sources. He believed that God is everywhere, in every moment, in every person, in all that is true and holy and beautiful. By absorbing the spiritual insights he learned from diverse sources, he hoped that in some way he was contributing to bringing these different sources to a meaningful integration. We are all one in God, even if we don't always recognize that. But through mysticism, we can experience that unity. To take away something practical from tonight, may I suggest that we discover with Merton the close affinity between art and contemplation? The creative spirit in Merton's mind is very adjacent to the Holy Spirit. This was because he himself was a contemplative with the equipment of an artist. Especially toward the end of his life, he experimented with different kinds of poetry, drawings, calligraphy, and photo art. Art is the embodiment of a spiritual insight. It captures a fleeting moment of truth and beauty with a touch of eternity. It brings many things together in a flash, matter and spirit, the creative mind, and the reality of the world. If we open ourselves to different kinds of art, if we can appreciate whatever is true and good and beautiful in different genres and cultures of art, we may also come to experience a bonding unity between the material world and the spiritual, between us and those who are different from us. Merton's own suggestion was this: learn how to meditate on paper. Drawings and writings are both forms of meditation. Learn how to contemplate works of art. Learn how to pray in the streets, in the country, anywhere. So this piece and the following pieces of art were all done by Merton. We will take a slow minute to ponder each of them, and for each I have attached a Merton quote on the meaning of prayer. Let us conclude by praying this prayer for unity, which Merton spontaneously prayed at a spiritual summit conference in Calcutta, India, days before his death. O God, we are one with you. You have made us one with you. You have taught us that if we are open to one another, you dwell in us. Help us to preserve this openness and to fight for it with all our hearts. Help us to realize that there can be no understanding where there is mutual rejection. O God, in accepting one another wholeheartedly, fully, completely, we accept you, and we thank you, and we adore you, and we love you with our whole being, because our being is in your being, and our spirit is rooted in your spirit. Amen. So that is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions about Merton mysticism, anything that comes to your mind, we will take them at this moment.
It seems like Thomas Merton had a lot of focus on the self as a way to get to God, and that seems a little bit unique in that mostly we hear about loving God and all the focus on God rather than the focus on oneself. Is that a correct understanding of Merton, or?
Yes, that is correct, and I'm not sure what your kind of feeling about that is. So I think that's a modern phenomenon, is this intense look into a person's interiority. So if you read John of the Cross, he doesn't talk about the self so much, right? What is really interesting is I find college students thinking like Merton does. So there was a student club at UD where one of my students was very active, and the motto of that student club was actually to search for the true, authentic self. And with that vision, they hope to develop their own style of leadership, right, to become successful in their education and in their future life. So I did want to make the point that this is where Merton was kind of unique, for better or worse. This is the situation where we're in. it's confusing to live in this world. So to find our authentic self, he believes if we truly stick with that path, in the end, we not only find ourselves, we also find God, because our true self is rooted in God. And that provides a way to begin wherever we are found. So I teach college students, and it's difficult to actually do my work because it is a Catholic university, and I imagine Catholic parents, when they send their children there, would want to keep their children in the Catholic faith. But by the time they reach college age, the students are everywhere. They are all searching, right? But their situation is very different from each other. And it does not help to, as professors, to tell them, this is what you need to think, this is what you need to believe, this is what you must do. They are already searching. So if we kind of follow Merton's way, then they can begin where they are, right? Do not, don't lose hope for these young people. Even if they might seem lost at times, if they are sincere in their search, eventually, I believe, as Merton does also, they will find God in their own timing and in their own particular way. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank you all very much for being here tonight. It has been a great pleasure to spend 2 evenings with you. God bless you.
Thank you so much for being here with us and for helping us grow in our understanding of Merton and exploring this new path or his path to holiness and to God. Thank you all for joining us. Next week we start exploring the life of Thea Bowman, so please join us for that, either in the church or on the live stream. Thank you all again for being here.